Chris Boshuizen, welcome to the Astro Ben podcast. How are you doing today?
Doing great, Ben. Thanks for having me.
It's I must say it's a real pleasure on multiple levels. As an entrepreneur myself, I am in awe of what you've accomplished today. So it really is. I really am excited to chat to you today. So thank you so much for coming on.
My pleasure.
So, what have you been up to recently? Is there anything in particular that you've done over the last couple of months that might be worth mentioning on a podcast?
Oh, I did some really cool stuff. I put out a song with Stephen Fry, the vocalist. I released another song that was a tribute to human spaceflight. And then I accidentally got myself on a human spaceflight. Just to bury the lead there.
I thought you were just going to tell me about your music, but let's start with the obvious. So you've been to space on a Blue Origin rocket. Do you consider yourself an astronaut now?
I do, and then we can get into all the reasons for why. But yeah, definitely.
If I ever get to where you are in terms of being able to get yourself on a Blue Origin rocket, or other transport means are kind of available now, I would certainly call myself an astronaut as well. How do you feel after it? It's obviously, the sad news about Glenn DeVries recently. Has that scarred your memory of it, or how does that recent event sort of impacted your whole experience of going to space?
I think it's made the space flight experience more precious, but it's definitely, it's a real bummer. And I think everyone who knew him and loved him is really cut up by it. I mean, it's both lovely that he got to fulfill his dream and go to space, and I'm glad that he was able to do that. But I just wish Glenn had been around long enough to enjoy the afterglow and to have time to remember it fondly as we are, and to do all of the things that we're doing. So it's absolutely tragic to lose him so early.
Yeah, I imagine. I'm sorry. I imagine having that shared experience that's so unique. There's definitely a special bond which you had with your crewmates. How did you find out about that William Shatner was going to be on your flight? Was that kept a bit of a surprise until a few weeks leading up, or did you have to sit on that for a few months?
I didn't sit on it I probably sat on it for 2 or 3 weeks. But there was a point where I knew they were trying to keep a seat for someone special. And obviously one of the goals that Blue Origin has is to get the word out that this is happening. And, in the space community, I'd say Glenn and I were fairly well known, but that's just a small community, and we want to reach out to the whole world. So I knew they had a spot saved up. I just didn't know who it would be. And then when they called me and they told me who it would be, they said, just want to check because you and Glenn are the actual paying customers, and we don't want this to overshadow what you've accomplished and are trying to do on this flight. Would you be okay if William Shatner flew with you? I'm like, are you kidding me? Come on, guys. Yeah, why are you even asking? Absolutely 100% okay with it.
You could have been like, I'm Team Star Wars, so no, I withdraw from the flight. But no,
yeah, no, lucky I'm a Trekkie, so yeah.
That's so cool. What did you have to do before the flight? Was there, from my understanding, there's kind of sort of basic training, but the idea is that it's accessible to anyone, regardless of your sort of level of fitness and mental agility, that kind of thing.
Yeah, because you have, by contrast, we have the SpaceX Inspiration 4 flight that flew just a month before us, a few weeks before us, actually. And that's a very different kettle of fish. And so you're in space for 3 to 4 days. You could have, and they did have, minor medical emergencies. There is more complex things they need to do, including, it turns out, making repairs to the toilet and making alternative arrangements. So the number of situations that someone on a long-term spaceflight has to deal with, it's almost uncountable. But on our shorter flight, it's not like I was going to get appendicitis in 12 minutes. And, even if I did, I'd be back on the ground. And so you don't have to be the finest specimens of fitness. And it's pretty amazing that we flew up, William Shatner at 90, who, by the way, is probably the most fit, healthy, agile, and quick-minded 90-year-old I've ever met. But so I'm not sure he's representative of the 90-year-old age group at all. But he was totally fine. Other than perhaps a little, and I can't blame him at 90. A little bit of discomfort on the way down when we were re-entering the atmosphere. He was totally fine. He probably doesn't like roller coasters at his age either. So
no.
Yeah.
Well, and how did you? What did the training consist of? Like, I assume it's kind of like how to get out of your seat and get back in afterwards. That kind.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. Before I got on site, a few weeks before, my girlfriend Vanessa and I, we went out and did the GoZeroG flight, and that was kind of a recommended experience to just get some acclimatization to weightlessness, and not kind of like didn't want to get up to space and go, oh my god, I'm weightless, and get giddy doing somersaults and then miss the view, right? So we went and did the GoZeroG thing beforehand. That was kind of optional, but we wanted to do it. I'm glad I did, because it did help me, not look so goofy when I was in space. By the way, on the GoZeroG thing, I looked really goofy, and Vanessa was much better at it than I was. But then when we got on site, it was really, like you said, just turns out getting into a seat in zero gravity is really hard. And you've got to be back in your seat and buckled up and ready to return through the atmosphere in about a minute is the amount of time they give you for that task. And so we drilled that for about 3 days, about 4 or 5 times a day. And I'd go to sleep thinking about the procedure, and you have to like hook an arm into a seatbelt, flip yourself into the seat, grab another handle, hook your feet in, then buckle this 5-point harness they have. So I drilled that dozens of times in my sleep, and obviously figured it out in the end. But yeah, it's not intuitive.
What was this is such an obvious question, but what was going through your mind on the launch pads? Because you had a 24-hour weather delay, didn't you? So you kind of had a practice run on mentally what you would go through on the run up to the launch.
Some people were disappointed, but as a lifelong space guy, almost every rocket that I've launched commercially with satellites on it has been delayed. And so this, for me, was like another check on my space bingo card. So I'm like, launch scrub. Yes, I've also experienced that. So I was really happy, actually, to have a scrub. And it also gave us a day to rest, which was nice, because the schedule is pretty grueling. So we had a scrub day, and once I explained that perspective to my other crewmates, they're like, oh, yeah, this is a great thing, and they check their own bingo card, like, mentally. Yeah, and then the morning of, though, I have to admit I was nervous. There's a video I did online, a little selfie reflection thing the morning of, and watching that after the flight, I'm like, oh, man, I look nervous. It's somber is the mood, I think. Because this is one of the arguments why I think we are astronauts and not tourists, is this is not a regular plane. This is not a Ryanair flight to Ibiza, right? It is a rocket. It is a hydrogen rocket. It's only flown at this point 18 times, which is a lot, and it seems remarkably safe. But it's a rocket, and rockets are not airplanes. And I think to everyone, my partner, everyone else's guests who were there, there was, the risk is palpable to everybody.
Although I don't know, maybe a flight to IB from Ryanair is more risky.
Depends who you're flying with, maybe, and don't eat the peanuts.
Yeah, exactly. So William Shatner called his flight a wake-up call. I think, people were pretty, especially people in the space industry, were pretty struck by his reaction, his genuine reaction upon returning to Earth. What did you experience seeing Earth from up there?
Yeah, well, I want to talk about his experience before I tell you about mine, because it was quite interesting. So he admitted to us during training that he was not a space guy, which might be a surprise to everyone else in the whole world. And he said there's a distinction in his mind between space fantasy and space reality. And myself and Audrey Powers, my other crewmate, we've both worked in the industry. We know a lot about space, and we've probably actually, as maybe you have and many people listening, thought about going to space and imagine what it's like. Every time I get on a plane, I think about, I pretend that the plane takeoff is actually a rocket. So it was kind of nice to get on the real thing. William Shatner admitted he'd never had those thoughts. He had worked in a green screen in movies. He'd made his own space fantasy stuff, but that didn't map to an internal recognition that he would ever go to space or that was something he could do. So he was about as green as a citizen could be when he showed up. And so his reaction was a really great benchmark, I think, of what it would be like if we start flying regular people to space and they got what they call the overview effect, to go up and to see that from a cold start and then realize, oh my God, look at that's our planet. And that's the reaction he had. And it was probably, of all the 600 astronauts who've flown to date, possibly one of the strongest reactions that anyone's ever had, I think. And I think that's representative of him coming in from really just a cold start. So I'm very excited for regular people to go up and experience that. My experience was a little different because I've lived in this industry my whole life. And, one of the things maybe we can talk about is this company that I co-founded called Planet, just over 10 years ago now, which is a remote sensing and mapping company. We take photos of the entire surface of the Earth every day. So I've kind of lived in that world. Unlike William Shatner, I've lived in that world a little. And so for me, the experience of looking down on the Earth was more of just a recognition of I was right the whole time. This is really important, but it wasn't a shock to me, which partly I was disappointed about. But then this other shocking thing happened to compensate me for that, which is when I looked out to space, I felt if human beings biologically have a gene for exploration, that gene triggered in me the second I looked out into the blackness of space. And so I coined a new phrase called the outer view effect, which is the one I had. And I got a really big case of we have to go further. We've got to row out beyond the shores of Earth and see what's out there in space. And I came back more motivated than I ever have been to continue to explore deep space.
The outer view effect, yeah. I guess for someone like you as well that's had such success in business and, you've traveled the world for a long time, it's very rare. Well, I don't know. I mean, even me, I don't feel like I'm exploring when I go anywhere, basically. It's kind of unless you go to the bottom of the ocean or the Antarctic, you're basically going somewhere that anyone can go to. So that outer view effect, I think, is pretty compelling. I read that quite a long time ago now. You said quite an off the cuff quote that what you want for the future of space is to make space travel as easy as catching a bus. When do you think we'll get there? When do you think flights like yours will become accessible to thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So from the Wright brothers to the Boeing 747, I think there were 49 years had elapsed. I think, if I got that correct, 1912 through to 1969. So in those 1959, right? No, 49 years. Yeah, so 69. That's roughly half a century, right? 50 years. I would say many people recognize the 747 as a game changer in sort of long haul, low cost travel for people. We had, earlier aircraft that could carry 20 people, 40 people, 80 people, but to have one now that could carry up to 200 or so on long haul flights, that really made the entire world accessible. And paved the way for, we make fun of them, but the Ryanairs of the future, right? These smaller aircraft, smaller carriers really relied on the innovation of essentially the Boeing and Airbus size aircraft. And that took 50 years. And I think if someone at the time of the Wright brothers said, we're going to build a jumbo jet, we're going to call it the jumbo jet, and we're going to put 300 people in it, and we're going to fly across the Pacific Ocean, I think they would have been laughed at. And I think that's equivalent to where we're at now. Is we've got the very first aircraft. Maybe it's like a Constellation. We can fly 10, 20 people. soon. But it's not affordable. The routes are short. My flight was very short, right? It was basically, a small hop. It's almost like we're still in the barnstorming era of aviation. So I think it'll take about 50 years, which might seem a painfully long time. But, in the scheme of the human race and doing things like tackling climate change and transforming how we manufacture and what an industry looks like, I think that's a good time scale. So there are people alive now who will be able to buy those bus tickets.
People like me, yeah?
Yeah. Definitely.
I'm clinging on. I need the price to come down a little bit, but I'll be there. So we mentioned Planet. Anyone who's in the space industry will have heard of Planet. It's such an impressive company. How did you come up with the idea? Was it sort of by chance you met your co-founder and you went out for beers and thought, oh, this would be cool? Or did it come from a sort of evolution of learning and you realized there was a market for data and taking satellite data and bringing it to life?
Yeah, it's probably a bit of both. That beer conversation just took 10 years. So the other principal co-founder that I started the company with, a Brit named Will Marshall, he and I spent about 10 years. We met at a space conference called the IAC, International Astronautical Congress. We met there in 2002, and we started Planet in 2012. So through that 10-year period, we were just trying to figure out why space was so inaccessible. There were very few space startup companies. There was SpaceX basically, and nobody else. It's hard to remember that now that there's so many, like thousands, there's hundreds of launch companies, thousands of satellite companies. It's hard to remember what it was like 20 years ago when the idea of a private space company was ludicrous. And so we were just trying to work out why the industry was moribund, right? Programs cost billions of dollars and were decades late. And going back to the moon was beyond NASA's capability. They could no longer make the Apollo rockets. I know this is a podcast, but I can see behind you, you have a model of, looks like the Lego model of the Saturn V, is it? You know, the US can't even make the Saturn V anymore because the tooling doesn't exist and most of the engineers who build it are retired or have sadly passed away. So it's almost lost to the mists of time. And so that was the background where we were trying to debug why space sucked. And one of the reasons we realized was that if you spend $1 billion on a satellite, you probably want to spend another $1 billion to check all the boxes. And suddenly that satellite goes from $1 billion to a $2 billion satellite. But if you can make them cheap, then you don't have to do that. You can just skip it and go, well, if we lose it, doesn't matter. And so we had this idea for a thing called the phone sat, which was, well, if you want to take some real risk and use cutting-edge hardware, there's a ton of innovation happening in the mobile phone and the cellular industry, Wi-Fi chip development, these low-power computers that are in your iPhones and your Android phones. They're like, they're high capability, low power consumption computers. They're like perfect for spacecraft. So we actually flew an Android phone as a free-flying satellite in orbit, and wrote an app, and that app took some pictures, used AI to score the pictures and pick the best one. It didn't do a great job, but it picked some pictures, and then radio those down to us on the ground. And so this was a $3,000 satellite. And because we were using cutting-edge hardware developed in industries outside of NASA, it was also the most capable satellite in orbit at that time, which is pretty remarkable. And so the bang for the buck was off the charts. And that's the moment where Will and I then went, hang on, we got something really cool here. If satellites could be this powerful and this cheap, and we could build hundreds of them and not be scared if we lost one or two, what could we do with it? And the first idea we had was to do an imaging constellation. Which was the highest value thing we could think of, was to map the whole world every day, and that's something no one had ever been able to do before.
And are you still the CTO?
No, I left about 5 years ago, actually. So the company is now about 11 years old, I think. And I left about 5 years ago and joined one of Planet's investors as a venture capitalist now. So amongst Planet being one of our investments, I've done a number of other space investments as well. Rocket Lab was a New Zealand launch company that just went public on the NASDAQ, which was a huge success for us. That was the first investment I did. We have some others, a radar company called Capella, and a GPS company that's doing a GPS augmentation constellation to add extra capabilities to GPS. So some pretty cool stuff.
Absolutely. So that's DCVC.
Yeah, that's right.
So would you say your main experience from Planet Labs was your sort of the business side of things? Because everything from the fundraising to the building a big business at that scale, it requires quite a strategic and quite a sort of forward approach to it. Is that would you see yourself as more of a sort of technologist or a business person?
Well, I think I approach business from a technology perspective, and businesses that are purely financial don't really interest me, particularly if you're just moving money around. That's an important part of our economy, but not something that personally interests me at all. But if you have a new technology that sort of fields a new capability that makes the world better, that's actually true wealth generation. And I think that's what interests me. The interesting thing about technology is before we didn't have a thing. Now that we've created it, we now have it, and it does something new. And so that's not just moving money around. It's actually creating wealth for the human race and making us all richer. And so I think for me, technology is the heart of making the planet safer and more comfortable, and dealing with climate change, and ultimately bringing millions and millions of people out of poverty as well, is true wealth creation, not just the movement of money. And so I'm very technocentric when it comes to investment, and I want to see companies that have a technology that creates something new and gives them, an unassailable advantage in the market. So, for instance, at Planet, our satellites weren't $1 billion. They were, in the mid tens of thousands, the price of a Honda Civic, basically. And so we could build a lot of them, and that meant that we could create this map of the world every day, which is a wealth of information that never existed before, and it has so many applications. And it was cheap to build. And the interesting thing is that the incumbent competition could never in a million years build something similar at their price point. They're just incapable of it. It would have cost them tens of billions of dollars to compete with us using their older, more expensive technologies. And so that's sort of the formula I look for in investments, is something new that makes the world richer, but is so cheap that why would you say no to it?
Yeah, and I guess someone looking to start a space industry startup today, they couldn't create a Planet. They couldn't create a SpaceX because that model kind of is already. What I'm trying to say is, with the space economy, being just on the horizon, anyone that can bring down the cost of access to space is going to do well. But you just have to find a different way to do it. So if you were to start a space,
I think I lost you, Ben.
Today.
Sorry, the call dropped for a sec there. Can we pick up with that question again?
Yeah, no, I'm still here. If you were to start a space tech company today, hey Chris, you still there? Hey Chris, can you hear me? Hey Chris. Hey Chris, can you hear me? Hey Chris, are you still there? I can hear you. Oh, I can see you. I can't hear you.